The government have all but admitted that no real progress whatsoever has been made on their promise to launch 5 local rape gang inquiries before Easter.
For over a decade, a hidden epidemic was unfolding across towns in the United Kingdom, and it was hiding in plain sight. In cities like Rotherham, Rochdale, Oxford, Telford and beyond, vulnerable young girls, many from troubled homes, some even in state care, were being targeted, groomed, raped and trafficked by organised gangs. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favour. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So, did you click the subscribe button? Great, thank you so much. Now, back to the video.
We need a specific inquiry into why young British white girls are being systematically raped by men of Pakistani heritage.
The details are difficult to hear, but they must be told. These weren't random, isolated attacks. These were systematic operations, carefully planned with victims passed between men like property. In Rotherham alone, an independent inquiry concluded that over 1,400 girls were abused between 1997 and 2013. Many were just children. They were threatened with violence, doused in petrol, told their families would be harmed if they spoke out. Some were branded, some were filmed, others simply vanished. The stories, the pain, the trauma, they're impossible to forget. And yet, for years, the institutions that were meant to protect these children turned away. They knew there were files, reports, meetings. Frontline workers tried to raise the alarm. Some teachers noticed bruises and behavioural changes. Social workers documented clear signs of abuse. Police had evidence, even names. But again and again, those warnings were ignored, or worse, actively suppressed. In some cases, whistleblowers were disciplined, silenced, or pushed out. And why? Why were the cries of these girls ignored? Why did the authorities fail so profoundly? The answer, as disturbing as it is, lies in fear. Fear of being labelled racist. Because in many of these high-profile grooming gang cases, the perpetrators were predominantly of Pakistani or South Asian descent, and the victims mostly white, working-class girls. This made the situation politically explosive. Councils, police departments and media outlets were paralysed not by confusion but by cowardice. Multiple internal documents revealed that officials were instructed not to pursue suspects too aggressively, out of concern it would inflame racial tensions. Some even admitted that they didn't want to be seen as targeting one ethnic group. So they chose silence, and that silence gave the abusers time, years of it. Inaction wasn't just a mistake, it was a calculated trade-off. The safety of children was weighed against political fallout, and the children lost. Political correctness became a shield, a smokescreen behind which real lives were shattered. And what about the media? Why weren't headlines blaring? Why wasn't the country in uproar when these stories first broke? Because they, too, hesitated. Newsrooms feared being accused of fueling anti-immigrant sentiment. Editors buried the story or reframed it into something softer, less controversial. And when the truth finally surfaced in full, when the cover-ups could no longer be denied, Britain was left asking one painful question: how many could have been saved if someone, anyone, had just told the truth earlier? This wasn't just a failure of the police. It wasn't just a failure of social services. It was a failure of will, a failure of courage, a failure of the very systems we trust to protect the innocent. For over a decade, political image was prioritised over child safety. Bureaucrats were more afraid of headlines than of what was happening in alleyways and bedrooms. And in that time, lives were destroyed, families were shattered, entire communities lost faith in justice. That loss of trust, that slow corrosion of belief in institutions is still being felt today. Because if the state can't protect your children, what is it even for? If the police turn their backs, if the media stays quiet, if politicians look away, where does that leave the victims? Where does that leave the rest of us?
Paul, that children are being protected. These are vile crimes against children, and across the country we have seen young girls, we have seen teenagers, and we have seen young boys who have been exploited in the most cruel and horrendous way by perpetrators.
What happened in towns like Rotherham wasn't just a criminal tragedy, it was a political reckoning. The silence surrounding these grooming gangs didn't come from ignorance, it came from fear. Fear of being labelled, fear of being accused of racism, fear of losing control over a politically delicate narrative. In today's Britain, where identity politics often dominates the national conversation, too many leaders chose to protect reputations instead of children. In some cases, politicians even knew what was happening but didn't speak out. Why? Because acknowledging the truth meant confronting an uncomfortable reality that multiculturalism, immigration, and integration are not always seamless, and that when cultural practices clash with British values and laws, someone must have the courage to draw a line. But that line was never drawn. Instead, officials tiptoed around the issue, carefully avoiding any language that might offend. But while they were protecting their image, abusers were free to operate and victims were left abandoned. Now, let's be clear, the vast majority of immigrants in the UK are law-abiding, decent people. The issue here isn't race or religion, it's the refusal to hold individuals accountable because of race or religion. That is what corrodes trust. When a group of criminals is shielded from scrutiny because of their ethnic background, while victims are dismissed as unreliable or problematic, it sends a chilling message that justice is not blind, that some groups are protected while others are expendable. And the British public notice. Many working class communities, particularly in the north, began to feel ignored, unheard, and deliberately gaslit. They saw what was happening, and they saw the media refusing to cover it. They heard police make excuses, they heard politicians deflect, and over time that silence drove them away from the mainstream and toward voices, sometimes extreme ones, who were at least willing to say what others wouldn't. This doesn't justify extremism, but it explains the growing anger, the rising distrust, and the political upheaval we've seen in the past decade. At the heart of it all is one terrifying question: who is being protected and why? Because it certainly wasn't the victims, not the girls whose lives were shattered, not the families who begged for justice, not the communities that felt completely abandoned.
You tell me, how many children across the Bradford district have been abused through child sexual exploitation? Who are the perpetrators? And when will my constituents expect to see them behind bars or deported?
Yeah. It was about avoiding controversy. It was about power. And when institutions prioritise power over truth, they betray the very people they exist to serve. So where does Britain go from here? Can trust ever be rebuilt? The answer lies not in more apologies or vague promises. It lies in transparency, in accountability, in leaders who are willing to face uncomfortable truths, even when it costs them politically. The time for silence is over, because silence didn't protect the victims, it empowered the abusers. If we want to heal, if we want to move forward, we must confront what happened, not spin it, not sanitize it, but face it with honesty. This is about more than grooming gangs. It's about what kind of country Britain wants to be. One that buries the truth for fear of offence, or one that protects its most vulnerable, no matter who the perpetrators are or what the political consequences may be. Because justice doesn't come from convenience, it comes from courage. And if this country still believes in justice, it's time to prove it, not just with headlines, but with action. Because in the end, silence isn't neutrality, it's complicity. And we've been silent for far too long.